Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to look at another forgotten weapons video. This is over the Swedish M94 carbine. This is something that's been talked about back and forth in a handful of comment sections from a whole bunch of different videos. And so I wanted to go ahead and jump into it and look at it. Before we get started, I'm very curious, not politically. You guys know I steer well clear of all the political stuff on the channel, strictly from my own personal curiosity. I love economics. I'm curious what the economic situation is in Sweden or wherever you are in Europe right now. I'm curious what the local economic conditions are, how things look, how they're changing from last year or from a handful of years ago. I'm just really curious about it. I've talked some on the Discord about some of the things that are going on in the US in regards to a shifting economy. But as we all know, economies are globally tied today. There's just really no way around it. The vast majority of economies in the world, and certainly the major economies, are in some way, shape, or form all tied together. So I'm just curious what it looks like where you are right now. So let me know. Put down in the comment section what's it look like on the ground there. But anyway, with all that being said, let's jump into it. Swedish M94.
Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at some of the guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming June of 2017 regional auction. And today we're going to take a look at Swedish Mauser carbines. They have several of them in this particular auction, and I thought it'd be a really good opportunity to take a look at some of the changes that took place with these carbines through their development and their service life. These are really cool, elegant, handy little carbines in the nice 6.5 by 55 millimeter Swedish cartridge. They're cool. It's about time we took a closer look at them. So, development of these started in the 1890s. Actually, before that, the Swedes had used the Remington rolling block for quite some time. Remington was kind of in this position like Mauser. In the mid-late 1800s, Remington supplied military arms for a very large number of smaller countries, countries that didn't necessarily have a lot of indigenous arms production. Well, they bought Remingtons, and then in the early 20th century, they tended to buy Mausers, and Sweden fell right into that paradigm.
Yeah, and that's more common in general for the 1800s, certainly the later 1800s. There are far less countries that have this big arms manufacturing happening domestically. It's just not the case. Now, major countries are, we look at this stuff when we look at, in Europe at least, when we look at things like the Franco-Prussian War and the build-up to World War I. There are countries, major countries, that they have their arms manufacturing, their defense sector is totally fine. It's working overtime. But there are a lot of countries that's not the case. It has not come around yet, or it came around for an instance, but then dropped back off. Similar to kind of what the U.S. faced on the backside of World War I, where you had this huge defense industry that really didn't have much to do, tried to continue to sell outside of the U.S., but a lot of them had a hard time doing that. New regulations got introduced to kind of stifle that, and so it goes away. That's the case, for a lot of different countries for a handful of different reasons. They're buying a lot of their, not just rifles and things like that, but they're basically buying everything arms related from an outside source. So yeah, big market for that.
In 1892, they decided to look for a replacement for the Remington rolling block. Apparently this bolt-action magazine rifle thing was probably a trend that was going to stick around. So they tested a number of different mechanisms. They tested Mausers, they tested Mannlichers, Lees, and Krag Jorgensens. The Krag Jorgensen, of course, had been adopted or would be adopted by several of their Scandinavian neighbors. But the Swedes decided that the Mauser was the best system for them. And so in 1894, they adopted a Mauser carbine, the M94 carbine. That's this rifle right here. By the way, these are the exact same size, but this one's in front, and I know it looks bigger on camera. Anyway, interestingly, the Swedes actually adopted a carbine before they adopted, several years before they adopted a full-length infantry rifle. Maybe they were more interested in getting repeating firepower for the cavalry quickly before the infantry, whatever their rationale.
That is very interesting. I'm trying to think of what was going on in Sweden at the time and leading up to this period that would make that decision the most prudent or practical. But that's very interesting that they went that route first.
That was the first rifle that they adopted. And also, interestingly, and this is not unique to the Swedes, the M94 cavalry carbine had no bayonet lug. We typically think of carbines as having bayonets, but a lot of people actually didn't. Some of the early Lee carbines did not. Many of the American carbines actually did not. The U.S. Krag Jorgensen carbine did not have a bayonet fitting. So the Swedes followed suit there, and production began in 1895. Now, the first guns were actually produced by Mauser in Oberndorf in Germany, the company that had provided the rifles for Swedish trials. What the Swedes did was they purchased about 12,000, I think it's actually 12,195 of these carbines from Mauser while they set up production at the Carl Gustaf plant in Sweden. So they both purchased rifles and they purchased a license to produce them on their own.
Yeah, where was that? Where was the initial Carl Gustaf mill or factory? Somebody has told me this story before, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. But where was it located?
So the first couple years, they got new rifles in from Mauser to start the transition to these new carbines. And after that, subsequent production was done at Carl Gustaf. In total, another 115,000 rifles, give or take, would be made by Sweden. Or I'm sorry, 115,000 carbines more would be made by Sweden, for a total of about 137,000 of these carbines made total.
Damn.
Now, they did undergo one substantial modification, and that was in 1914. The Swedes did decide to add a bayonet lug. I don't know the exact circumstances of this decision, but my assumption would be that they realized that they were starting to issue these to a lot of troops other than strict cavalry. Cavalry originally didn't need a bayonet because, well, for one thing, they weren't fighting in a square, and they typically had a saber. Well, if you start issuing these out to guys like supply troops or drivers or messengers or artillery crewmen, those guys have a more justifiable use for a bayonet. They may actually be in more hand-to-hand combat and they won't have a saber. So,
I actually read a really interesting book. I believe it was in a military history class. We had to read this book for the class, and it was over a lot of the psychology behind warfare, and it's not just modern warfare, but historical warfare too. And one of the things that it hits on in quite a big stretch of the book is this idea that the further we get through history, the closer we get to the modern day, the more squeamish we get about the idea of using bayonets or knives or swords in general. And it's basically this idea that with the gunpowder age and kind of the further back you get from what warfare was for forever, which was hand to hand, the further you get from that, the more that people had a complete shunning or vitriolic reaction to the idea, not just of being cut or stabbed, but of actually doing it to an enemy. It was something that just across the board, all of these people hated. Soldiers who fought just hated it. And that's a really interesting concept to me because, well, there's a lot of reasons, but a big part of it is because bayonets are so common throughout this entire age here. And one of the things that it talks about in the book is kind of this idea that more historians are starting to think that even in the latter years of bayonet use, the bayonets themselves were actually not used very often. Instead, soldiers would turn the gun around and basically use it like a club if they were going to be hand to hand, or they would just fire in extreme close range. Anyway, the whole thing is incredibly interesting to me. I'm kind of annoyed that I can't think of the name of the book off the top of my head, but maybe I'll think of it before the end of the video.
As with some other countries, the Swedes decided to add a bayonet lug to the M94 carbine. And in this format, like this guy right here, this became the 94/14 carbine. And we'll take a closer look at exactly how the bayonet was fitted in a moment. But there was then one other change to the guns, which was actually a change to the ammunition. And unlike most other countries, when this happened, they didn't change the guns at all. In 1941, the Swedes finally adopted a Spitzer version of the 6.5x55 cartridge.
Gotcha.
The rifles manufactured after 41, by which time these carbines had ceased production. The new rifles that were being manufactured had sights that were calibrated for that Spitzer ammunition. Because it has a better ballistic coefficient, it'll have less drop over range, and so your sight calibrations have to be a bit different. Most countries, when they made a change like this, would go back and modify the rear sights on all of their guns so that they would work properly with the new ammunition. The Swedes decided it really wasn't that big a deal, and so instead they just mounted a little guide plate on the side of the older carbines to tell you what your sight settings should actually be. So
That's actually kind of hilarious to me because I've talked before about how Sweden, certainly more so than, at least in my opinion, the US, they're good about finding something that works and then like not messing with it or scrapping it to the point that it's like a totally different thing. And I feel like this is almost an extreme version of that, where they're like, no, we're not pulling all these firearms, we're not pulling all these carbines and making, this slight adjustment on it. Instead, we'll just put this little plaque on the side, and every individual soldier can see the plaque and know what the distances are. And over time, they'll get used to it anyway. They'll know what adjustments to make. I don't know, something about that's just funny to me.
why don't we go ahead and take a closer look at that, as well as the mechanical elements of this rifle that distinguish it from some of the other Mausers out there. So the markings that we are most interested in are going to be on the top of the receiver crest, and that's the date of production and the location of production. So I have here one of the very first rifles made by Mauser in Oberndorf, dated 1895, and then the subsequent Swedish production will have a Swedish royal crest on it, and then Carl Gustafstad was the rifle factory. This is a 1907 production gun. Now, people are going to ask about...
I've heard kind of conflicting things here. Is that the royal crest, or is that the Carl Gustav thing, logo, whatever? I've heard a couple of different people say different things. What specifically is that marking?
Husqvarna. Husqvarna did in fact make Swedish Mauser rifles, but they didn't make any of these carbines, or they didn't do the mass production on the carbines. They did make at least a couple here and there, but later than after standard carbine production had ended. Mauser made these in 1895 and 96, and then it appears that Carl Gustaf was up and running on these by like 1898, and produced them ultimately until 1913, but not in a continuous normal or a continuous sequence. There were periods where they produced a lot and periods where they didn't produce really any. You'll find the production is primarily between 1898 and 1907, and then again between 1914 and 1918. The rifle's serial number will be located on the left side of the receiver right here. along with an inspector's set of initials, that's the JV. And then you'll also find 3 digits of the serial number on most of the major components. You can see that here on the cocking piece, here on the bolt release lever, here on the top of the butt plate, and many other places.
Yeah, and for older firearms like this is, pretty common. When you're going through looking at an old piece, this is really how you tell if all of the parts are original and to the same gun and all that.
Now, mechanically, the Swedish Mauser is a cock on closing action. So the firing pin spring is not tensioned when you open the bolt. And by the way, it does have a follower that will stop the bolt from operating when the magazine is empty. So that lets you know that you're out of cartridges. When you then close the bolt, like a Lee Enfield, it gets to here, and then you have to tension the firing pin spring in order to close the bolt. Some people prefer the cock on closing system. Some people prefer to have a cock on opening system. There are kind of arguments both ways. Now, you have a standard Mauser style flag safety.
As somebody who has smashed the shit out of their thumb, I would prefer this one.
Which can, of course, be engaged when the rifle is cocked. The center position is for disassembly. And one of the things that the Swedes did was actually, that was a change from the standard 1893 pattern of Mauser, was they wanted this set so that you could also engage the safety when the rifle had been fired, presumably for kind of a range protocol sort of thing. You can always engage the safety on a Swedish Mauser. Kind of a cool addition there. They also added checkering on the top of the cocking piece so that this can be gently lowered by hand. In theory, you could recock it by hand, but that's quite difficult. The standard 1893 Mausers did not have this graspable piece there. And then the Swedes also have a cutout for stripper clips. That is, of course, how this would load 5 rounds in a stripper clip. And the bolt guide rib is slightly improved over the standard 1893 pattern to make the bolt operation a little bit smoother. The rear sight here goes up to 1,600 meters.
Yeah, has anybody ever had that happen before, where the bolt comes down on your thumb? Like, there's a whole handful of different reasons why you would be fiddling with it. Whether it's loaded or unloaded or whatever. Whether it's you're looking to clear it or there's some sort of jam or whatever. But yeah, I had a huge gash in the side of my thumb. Golly, it felt like forever from the bolt closing on my thumb whenever I was messing with it.
Pretty standard ladder type sight, like so. You'll notice the little crown acceptance marks on pretty much all of the parts, part of the inspection process. And then these have the big protective wings that are kind of typical on a number of early Mauser carbines. Now, the upgrade to the 1914 pattern was basically the addition of this bayonet lug on the bottom. This is a really long, hefty piece of hardware that they put on there with a couple of purposes. There's a lug here on the bottom, and this is what the bayonet would actually attach to. As with the British and the SMLE, this was there so that you weren't actually putting weight on the barrel itself when hanging a bayonet on the end of the gun. So the idea was to reduce the effect that the bayonet would have on changing your point of impact. It's not a bad idea. Now, there's a difference you can see here. This 9414 has a muzzle that extends as far as the bayonet lug, while this model 1907, or 1894, I'm sorry, does not. This one is actually quite unusual to find in this configuration, and this is how all of these guns were originally made. However, the barrel length on these things is 17.7 inches, and when most of them were imported into the United States, the National Firearms Act in the US still held that 18 inches was the minimum legal length for a rifle barrel. Anything less would have required registration as a short-barreled rifle.
Interesting.
So when these were imported, the vast majority of them had about a 3/8 inch extender permanently affixed to the end of the barrel, and that's what you have right there. So we have a quite substantial bayonet here.
Yeah.
It does actually have a button locking the scabbard in place. It is a double-edged bayonet and simply locks onto the locking lug and the front lug. The slings on these carbines are kind of an interesting design. They have a standard loop up front and a lot of adjustability to them, and then they go through the stock here, kind of like a German style of sling, but they are a little bit different.
Yeah, I saw it on that side right there from at the beginning of the video, and was kind of wondering what the thought process was there.
On these Swedish carbines, the rear half of the sling is actually permanently screwed into the stock. And we've got a buckle right there. And so what happens is the end of the sling comes through the slot in the stock, hooks onto this buckle, and then there's a little keeper here for the whatever leftover bit of the sling there. So you can take the sling off, but this rear buckle remains attached to the rifle. Some of the guns will have a unit marking disc up here on the top, although this is relatively uncommon, and this one has actually had its markings ground off. More commonly, you'll find a unit disc here. And that disc identifies the unit that the rifle was issued to, not surprisingly. So this is I-5, this is the 5th Infantry, company number 8, and this is rifle number 158 of that company. You'll find a whole bunch of different abbreviations down here, as well as occasionally designations for training rifles, for rifles that were issued to the Landsturm, the National Guard, and various other.
I've talked about this before. This is why old firearms are so interesting to me. They tell a story of a snapshot in history. All of them do, and they're so interesting to me because of that. It's like this firearm itself. Obviously, it tells you basically why it was made, where it was sent, what number it was, everything like that. But then in a broader view, with looking at historical weapons in general, they normally tell a story of what was going on for the country that was making them at the time. Why did they go to this weapon? What changes did they make from a previous version? It tells a story of what their thought process was, what they were thinking. I've talked about this before with ancient history, where one of the clues I used to sort of get an insight into the thought process of the time is the gods that societies follow and the traits that they put on the gods and hold in high value. And it gives like a unique insight into the traits and features and ideals that society valued. And I feel like firearms can sort of give you an insight along the same lines but it's from the perspective of national, regional, local defense.
Groups. Now, I mentioned that when they changed cartridge, they didn't bother changing the sights. They just gave you a table of new ranges and sight settings to use. And this is an example of that table. Now, you may be looking at this and thinking those idiots put it on upside down, but they were actually a little more clever than that. This disc is fitted such that when you are holding the rifle right-handed, as the vast majority of soldiers would, you can simply tilt the rifle slightly to the side, look down over the side of the stock, and read that disc while you have the rifle, or read that chart while you have the rifle shouldered.
Smart.
So you don't have to take the rifle down and flip it around and then try and figure out what your sights are supposed to be. You can actually read it from a shooting position. And if we take a closer look at this, you'll note that this is specifically for the M94, because the M96 long rifles would have a slightly different set of changes because they had longer barrels. And this translates into basically shooting Spitzer rounds. What you would do is, this is the range that you want to shoot at, and this is the sight setting that you use. So if we want to shoot at 50 meters, we're going to set the sight to 300, which is its lowest position, and then we're going to aim 2 decimeters low, so 20 centimeters low. That would be about 8 inches low. I think they decided that there just wasn't, people weren't shooting all that much at long range, and so it was simpler just to do an adjustment table like this. rather than go through and actually try and collect up all the rifles and replace their rear sights. In addition to that aluminum plate that has been tacked onto the stock, you will also sometimes find them with a paper chart that has been shellacked onto the stock. And that's what we have in this case. Now, I should also point out that the change from round nose to Spitzer wasn't necessarily all that significant ballistically. The original round was 156 grains at 2,300 feet per second, or 10.1 gram at 700 meters per second. The change to the Spitzer reduced the bullet weight to 139 grains, moving at 2,450 feet per second, which would be 9 grams at 745 meters per second. So it was a change. It did impact the sight settings, but it wasn't a huge change, which may be why the Swedes didn't bother to make that change until 1941. These carbines do get faked from time to time because they do command a premium over long rifles on the collector's market. And so there are a couple things that you can do to verify the authenticity of a 94 or a 9414 carbine. The simplest one is to just compare the serial number and the production date on the receiver. These rifles were made in a separate serial number range from the long rifles, or these carbines, I should say. And so if you have, for example, if you have an alleged carbine with a serial number over 140,000, well, you know right away that that's not an original carbine because they only made less than 140,000 of these. Beyond that, when you have serial numbers that are in the potentially correct range, you can compare those to the production date on the receiver and see if that number actually matches what the production would have been in that year. That's an option, and there are data tables out there on the internet of production date and serial number for Swedish Mauser carbines. You can also look at some of the elements like the location of the grasping grooves in the stock, because they were different on rifle and carbine stocks. So if someone has tried to take a rifle stock and cut it down to fit a carbine, that can usually be detected. At any rate, there are a number of these guns here in this particular auction, and so if you're interested in these two, there are links to them in the description text below, and there are several others in the catalog, so a bit of searching there can find you a couple more if you'd like to pick up a handy little Swedish Mauser carbine for your own collection. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, I really like these videos. I feel like Ian, I believe is his name, I feel like he does a really good job. And like I said, old firearms are they're just too cool to me. They really are. I've got a couple of family members that have some older pieces, and I just like them. I'm a sucker for them. I like to kind of tinker with them and see how they work, and they're actually more interesting to me personally than modern firearms are. Even though I know modern firearms they have really, really cool stuff. Some of the designs are pretty incredible, but I'm just a sucker for older pieces. So that was another great video over the Swedish M94. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here, and I will see you all next time.